Huichen Forest, Germany, November 1944. The air is thick with the smell of damp pine and frozen earth. A squad of American infantry, part of the 28th Division, moves cautiously along a fire break, the mud sucking. At their boots, the only sounds are the crunch of frost, labored breathing, and the distant thump of artillery miles away. It is a deceptive quiet. Then a singular, hollow thump echoes through the trees. It is not the sharp crack of a rifle nor the deep roar of a cannon. It is a dull, metallic cough, unmistakable to any veteran of the European front. A young rifleman freezes, his eyes wide. Mortar. The word is a prayer and a curse. There is no immediate whistle, only a terrifying 3-second silence as the 8 cm projectile arcs high into the gray sky. Time stretches. The men dive for cover behind shattered stumps, into shell holes half filled with icy water. The first round lands 20 yards off with a concussive crump. Frozen soil and splintered wood erupt in a black geyser. The shockwave punches the air from lungs. Before the debris has settled, a second thump sounds from the German lines, hidden the mist-shrouded hills, then a third. This is not harassing fire. This is a Feuerüberfall. Firestorm. The rounds walk in with methodical, brutal precision, creeping closer with each eruption. The forest, a moment ago a place of eerie calm, is now a hell of screaming metal and shrapnel. The Americans are pinned helpless. They cannot see the enemy. They can only hear the deadly cough of the tube and wait for the earth to explode beneath them. This was the sound of German infantry dominance, a weapon that had terrorized armies from the gates of Moscow to the beaches of Normandy. But in the muddy crypt of the Huichen, a silent revolution was brewing, a mathematical arms race that would turn this terrifying equation on its head. The relentless precision of the barrage highlighted a desperate question: how do you counter an enemy you cannot see, but who can calculate your death with such speed? To understand the dread inspired by that hollow thump, one must go back to the ashes of the First World War. In the static slaughter of the trenches, the mortar had proven its worth: simple, portable, and capable of dropping high-explosive shells into enemy dugouts at short range. It was the perfect tool for trench warfare. When the Versailles Treaty dismantled the German general staff and severely restricted conventional artillery, German military thinkers, operating in secret and then under the guise of the Reichswehr, did not discard the lessons of 1914-1918. They refined them. Under the leadership of visionaries like Hans von Seeckt, the German army embraced a doctrine of mobility, encirclement, and deep battle, Bewegungskrieg, the war of movement. In this new concept, which would become known as Blitzkrieg, every element had to keep pace with the tanks. Heavy, towed artillery could lag behind a rapid advance. The mortar, however, could go anywhere infantry could. It became the battalion commander's personal artillery, his immediate fist. The Wehrmacht standardized two masterful designs. The *5 cm liked Granatwerfer. 36 * was a platoon-level weapon, but the true backbone of their system was the *8 cm Schwer Granatwerfer 34 *. This was a masterpiece of utilitarian engineering, weighing just over 136 pounds in 3-man portable components: baseplate, bipod, and tube. It could be set up or displaced in minutes. Its smoothbore tube fired a 7.5-pound high explosive shell to a maximum range of 2,400 meters. The key to its lethality, however, was not in its physical specifications alone, but in the doctrine woven around it. German mortar teams were not mere auxiliaries, they were highly trained specialists. Integrated at the lowest tactical levels, a standard infantry battalion had a dedicated heavy weapons company which operated 6 of these 8 cm mortars, their crews trained relentlessly on a core principle: Geschwindigkeit, speed to deploy, speed to acquire a target, and most critically, speed to fire the first adjusting round. German fire direction was streamlined. Forward observers, often seasoned NCOs, communicated directly with mortar sections using field telephones or radios. They used pre-planned firing points and practiced a lethal technique called Punktaktik, sponge tactic, where multiple mortars would concentrate their fire on a single pinpoint target, saturating it with high explosives in a matter of seconds. This system turned the mortar from a supporting weapon into a primary killer. In the opening campaigns, Poland, France, the Low Countries, the Granatwerfer proved devastating. It could silence machine gun nests, break up infantry assemblies, and provide instant, responsive smoke screens, all while keeping pace with the charging panzers for the opposing infantry. It created a pervasive sense of vulnerability. The front was not just ahead of you. Death could descend, unseen and sudden, from the sky above. By the time the United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the German mortar system was a polished, feared instrument of combined arms warfare, a tool that gave every German infantry battalion the organic, rapid-fire power of light. Artillery. The United States, however, had watched the war from a distance and developed a profoundly different artillery philosophy, one that initially left its infantry dangerously exposed to the storm of German mortar fire. The United States Army of the interwar years possessed an almost theological faith in the power of massed, coordinated artillery fire. The doctrine was born in the final, grand offensives of 1918, where American guns had spoken with a thunderous, industrial voice. This philosophy centered on the concept of the Fire Direction Center, FDC. Observers would call targets to these centralized hubs, often at the regiment or division level, where specialists performed complex trigonometric calculations to coordinate the fire of entire battalions of 105 and 155 howitzers. The goal was not speed in the German sense, but overwhelming, crushing weight of metal delivered with systematic precision. The infantry's own organic mortars, the 60 and 81 models, were seen as secondary tools for illumination, close-in suppression, or as a last resort when heavier artillery couldn't be brought to bear. Their fire control was rudimentary, relying on simpler, slower methods of calculation and direct line-of-sight engagement. This doctrinal gap became a lethal chasm in the first American encounters with the Wehrmacht in the tangled hills of Tunisia in late 1942 and early 1943. Green U.S. troops, like those of the II Corps, faced the hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps and the Hermann Göring Division. The Americans learned a brutal lesson. German mortars did not operate like American ones. A patrol would be spotted within minutes, sometimes seconds. The first ranging round would land with unnerving accuracy. The adjusting round would be closer, and then the bunk-tick-tick would begin, a torrent of 3, 4, 6 rounds from different tubes, all converging on the kill zone in a terrifying symphony of destruction. The U.S. response was agonizingly slow by comparison. Forward observer, if he had one attached, would have to radio back through a chain of command. The request would be processed, calculations made using cumbersome graphical plotting boards or firing tables, and only then would a single mortar section, often out of communication with others, begin a slow, bracketing fire mission. By the time American high explosives began to fall, the German mortars had finished their work, broken down their tubes, and vanished into the landscape. The psychological toll was immense. GIs began to refer to the 8cm mortar's projectile with grim nicknames, the sighing death or the moaning mini, for the distinctive sound of its flight. It bred a feeling of helplessness. You could dig in against rifle fire. You could hear artillery coming from miles away, but the mortar was intimate, sudden, and seemingly omniscient. It turned every exposed field, every crossroads, every woodline into a potential death trap. In the close, brutal terrain of Italy's mountains and later the hedgerows of Normandy, this German advantage was magnified. Visibility was often limited to a few hundred yards, negating American advantages in long range artillery spotting and tank support. In this environment, the German battalion commander Granatwerfer was king. The U.S. infantryman felt this disparity in his bones. He was at the sharp end of a scientific problem. The enemy possessed a faster, more agile calculus of death. To survive, the American army would have to reinvent not just a weapon but a process. They would have to learn to think faster. The crucible of combat had exposed a fatal lag in the American system, a gap between observation and annihilation that the Germans had all but closed. The race was now on. To bridge it, a race measured not in yards, but in seconds. For the German Granatwerfer crew, efficiency was a matter of pride and survival. Standard team consisted of 3 men, the gunner Richtkanonier, the assistant gunner, and the ammunition bearer. The gunner was the artist of the piece, kneeling behind the bipod. His world narrowed to the sight unit, a bubble level, and the distant sound of his forward observer's voice over a field telephone, his hands moved by drilled instinct. Twist of the traversing handwheel for direction, a crank of the elevating mechanism for range. The assistant fed the fin-stabilized rounds, carefully removing the safety pins, while the bearer kept a steady supply from the ammunition cases. In action, they operated in near silence, a smooth, mechanical ballet. Their confidence was born of thousands of practice rounds. They knew their weapon could hit a specific window in a village house or plaster a machine gun nest on a reverse slope. This proficiency granted them a terrifying initiative. They didn't just respond to threats, they actively hunted, creating zones of denial that shaped the entire enemy infantry advance. For the American 81 Mortar crew, the early war experience was one of frustration and vulnerability. Their M1 mortar was a robust weapon with a greater range and heavier shell than the German 8cm, but its employment was clunky. Setting up required more time. Fire direction often came from a distant officer, leading to confused calls and delays. In a defensive scrape, they felt like targets, their slower rate of fire and less agile displacement making them susceptible to the very counter-battery fire they struggled to deliver. The human experience was defined by a reactive posture, waiting for orders, while death calculated its approach from the other side of the hill. The German tactical integration of the mortar reached its zenith in the concept of the Führerüberfall, which Allied troops would come to know as the Stunk. This was not mere harassing fire. It was a meticulously planned, sudden concentration of mortar fire from multiple batteries onto a single critical point, a forming up area, a command post, a key stretch of trench or road. The goal was not just to destroy, but to paralyze. The psychological shock of the first, accurate salvo was followed by the relentless, pounding rain of high explosive that prevented movement, broke communications, and sowed chaos. This tactic was the scalpel to artillery's sledgehammer. It allowed German infantry commander to dominate his immediate battlefield without waiting for higher-level artillery support. In the attack, mortars provided a rolling smoke screen and suppressed enemy strongpoints moments before the assault troops closed in. In defense, they made the ground in front of their positions untenable, breaking up Allied probes before a full-scale counterattack could be mustered. For the American infantry platoon, a stunk was a defining moment of terror. It meant being trapped in a hole, command and control shattered, with no ability to shoot back at an unseen enemy. It gave the Germans a disproportionate hold on the battlefield's rhythm. The American response, calling in a pre-planned artillery barrage from guns miles to the rear, was powerful but slow, like calling down a lightning bolt when you needed a precision strike. The tactical imbalance was clear. The Germans owned the first critical minute of any engagement. To seize it back, the Americans would need to match not just firepower, but tempo. This tactical dominance was built upon a foundation of both robust technology and a streamlined, almost intuitive fire control procedure that made the German system so responsive. The weapons themselves told a story of differing priorities. The German *8cm GRW 34 * was a model of elegant, lightweight simplicity, its smoothbore design reduced friction, allowing a consistent charge system to propel its shell. The sighting unit, the Richtiefsatz 34, was robust and straightforward, designed for rapid layering. The ammunition was equally refined. the Wurfgranate 34 high-explosive shell had a well-designed fragmentation pattern and a sensitive impact fuse, its greatest technological advantage, however, was its incremental charge system. Propellant charges were contained in horseshoe-shaped increments attached to the tail fin assembly. By snapping off unused increments, the gunner could precisely tailor the range without changing the weapon's elevation dramatically, allowing for faster adjustments. The American M181 mortar, in contrast, was a heavier, more complex piece. It was a rifled weapon, which gave its projectile greater inherent accuracy and a longer maximum range, over 3,000 meters, but this rifling made it more sensitive to wear and required more meticulous cleaning. Its standard sight, the M4, was a precise optical instrument but more fragile and slower to employ under fire. Crucially, its fire control was more rigid. Range was adjusted primarily by altering the angle of the tube and by using a selection of propellant charges held in separate cloth bags, a process that was more time-consuming than the German snap-off system. Technologically, the M1 was arguably the superior weapon in terms of potential accuracy and power, but the German system, weapon, ammunition, and sight was optimized for speed in the hands of a trained crew. It was a tool designed for the operational tempo of the Bewegungskrieg. The heart of the German advantage lay not in the tube, but in the mathematics that guided it. Their fire direction procedure was brutally efficient. A forward observer, armed with a detailed map and a practiced eye, would identify a target. He would estimate the range, often using known reference points or a simple stadiometric reticle in his binoculars. He would then call this data directly to the mortar section leader. Target: infantry in the open, grid 4217, range 1200, one round, fire. The gunner would set his sight using pre-calculated data cards or a Schustaffel firing table, a simplified graphical aid. The first round was fired within a minute of observation. The observer watched the impact, then called a quick correction, 100 left, 50 add. Using his rule of thumb knowledge of his weapon's dispersion, the gunner adjusted. The second round was often lethal, and the fire for effect could begin. The American procedure was a victim of its own rigor. An observer's call went to a fire direction center. There, a trained soldier, often a corporal or sergeant, would have to manually plot the target and mortar position on a map, determine the exact grid coordinates for both, then use a lengthy firing table full of raw ballistic data to compute the firing azimuth and charge required. This data was then phoned to the mortar section. The process, while accurate, could take 5 minutes or more under ideal conditions, an eternity in a firefight. Practice, maps were lost, phone lines were cut, and the FDC became a bottleneck. The procedural gap was the true source of the fear of the Wehrmacht's mortars. It was a gap of seconds, minutes, and mental agility. Closing it would require not just better tools, but a fundamental rethinking of how to solve a ballistic problem under the extreme pressure of combat. It was within this procedural labyrinth that a spark of innovation finally ignited, born from the necessity to strip away complexity and deliver raw, actionable speed to the men in the lines. The turning point did not arrive with a new weapon, but with a new piece of paper. By mid-1944, after the brutal lessons of Tunisia, Italy, and the Normandy hedgerows, the U.S. Army recognized its systemic failure. The problem was diagnosed with crystalline clarity. The time from call to fire was too long. The German crew could execute 3 complete fire missions in the time it took an American team to compute and fire 1. The solution had to be radical, decentralized, and idiot-proof. It had to move the calculus from the remote fire direction center directly to the mortar section itself, and it had to be performed in seconds, not minutes. The breakthrough came from an unexpected fusion of artillery science and pragmatic field adaptation. The U.S. Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory, along with officers in the field artillery and infantry branches, began work on a revolutionary tool, the graphical firing table. This was not a booklet of dense numbers. It was a single laminated sheet of paper or a set of cards specific to each type of mortar and ammunition lot. On it was a series of pre-drawn curved lines representing ranges and radial lines representing azimuths. The magic was in its simplicity. The mortar section leader, positioned with an observer, only needed two pieces of information: his own location and the target's location, both plotted on his standard map. He would then use a simple plastic plotting scale, often just a straight edge with a graduated arc, to measure the direct line between these 2 points. This line gave him both the precise range and the magnetic azimuth to the target in one action. He then turned to the graphical firing table. He found the curve corresponding to the measured range and followed it until it intersected the radial line for his azimuth. At that intersection was a small box containing 2 numbers, the charge to use and the elevation setting for the mortar's sight. This was the distilled essence of thousands of complex ballistic calculations rendered instantly accessible. No trigonometry, no manual computation, no communication lag with an FDC. The data was extracted in under 30 seconds. The gunner at the tube received not a string of coordinates, but direct executable orders. Charge 3, elevation 1250. He would set his sight. The assistant would prepare the correct propellant charge, and the first round could be on its way in less than a minute from the initial observation. The psychological shift was immediate. For the first time, the American mortar team possessed the same initiative as their German counterparts. They could engage fleeting targets, a half-track nosing out of a tree line, an enemy patrol crossing a road, with a speed that approached the German standard. But the innovation did not stop there. The system was designed for the chaos of real combat. If the first round was off, the observer used the same graphical principle for corrections. He estimated the error meters left or right and add or drop. The section leader would simply shift his plotting scale accordingly on the GFT, read the new firing data, and transmit it. The adjustment was nearly as fast as the initial fire command. This was more than a new tool. It was a new doctrine compressed onto a laminated card. It empowered the lowest tactical echelons, trusting the sergeant and corporal with the power of instant, accurate, indirect fire. The race was no longer about who had the better mortar, but about who could solve the firing equation faster. The Americans had just changed the variables. The true test of this revolution would not be on a training range, but in the frozen hell of the Ardennes and the shattered towns of the German frontier, where seconds still meant the difference between life and death. The Battle of the Bulge, December 1944, provided the furnace in which the new American system was tempered. In the chaos of the German surprise offensive, with units fragmented, communications shattered, and fronts blurred, centralized fire control often collapsed. It was in these isolated pockets of resistance that the graphical firing table proved its worth. At the critical crossroads of Bastogne, surrounded and under constant bombardment, the 101st Airborne Division's mortar sections operated with desperate autonomy. Observers on the perimeter, watching German infantry and armor massing in the woods, could call fire directly to their crews. Using their GFTs, crews could deliver punishing, accurate barrages on forming up areas within a minute, breaking up attacks before they gained momentum. The speed of response created a defensive bubble of steel around the besieged town, a responsive curtain of fire that compensated for their lack of heavy artillery shells. But the more profound and telling shift occurred during the subsequent Allied counter offensive. As they drove into the heart of Germany in early 1945, the warfare became a brutal series of village clearings and river crossings, precise, close-quarter actions, where the first side to bring effective indirect fire to bear would win the street, the bridge, or the hill. American infantry companies, now equipped with and trained on the GFT system, began to seize the initiative. A classic scenario unfolded near the Roer River. In February 1945, a U.S. rifle platoon was pinned by intense machine gun fire from a Fortified farmhouse. The platoon leader, crouched behind a stone wall, plotted his position and the farmhouse on his map. His mortar squad leader, beside him, used his plotting scale and GFT. Within 45 seconds, the call went to the 81 tube set up in a courtyard behind them. The first round was a white phosphorus marker, bursting directly over the farmhouse roof. It was not a ranging shot in the old sense, it was a verification. The correction was minor drop 50, fire for effect. The next 3 high-explosive rounds walked directly into the building's upper floors. The machine gun fell silent. The entire engagement, from the initial call to the destruction of the target, took under 2 minutes. For the German defenders used to owning this rapid-fire timeline, the effect was disorienting and demoralizing. The American mortar fire was now arriving with a speed and accuracy that mimicked their own, but often with greater explosive weight. The hunter was becoming the hunted. The technological and procedural revolution was complete. The U.S. had not merely copied the German method, it had leapfrogged it with a more sophisticated, yet simpler, system of democratized ballistics. The German cruise speed still relied on the practiced estimation of a seasoned observer and gunner. The American system removed estimation and replaced it with a graphical certainty that any trained soldier could execute. The fear began to invert. German infantry, who had long relied on the swift retribution of their Granatwerfer to punish American audacity, now found that same audacity answered with shocking immediacy. The mathematical advantage, the seconds that defined survival, had been decisively neutralized, then captured. This shift in the very rhythm of the firefight marked the end of an era of German infantry dominance and set the stage for the final, lopsided battles of the war's conclusion. The statistical aftermath of this quiet revolution is difficult to isolate in raw casualty. Figures for mortar effects were woven into the broader tapestry of artillery and direct fire, but its impact is vividly recorded in the shifting psychology of the battlefield and the after-action reports of 1944-45. U.S. Army studies conducted by historical and tactical analysis teams noted a marked increase in the effectiveness of organic mortar support in the final year of the war. A report from the 29th Infantry Division in the push toward the Elbe River starkly concluded, where previously the enemy mortar was the most feared infantry weapon, our own 81 mortar sections, using graphical firing data, have repeatedly beaten the enemy to the punch, silencing his guns and breaking up his attacks before they could be fully developed. The German perspective confirms this shift. Interrogations of captured Granatwerfer crewmen and infantry officers revealed a growing sense of vulnerability. One captured Oberleutnant of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division lamented, "March 1945, your infantry became bolder. They would probe, draw fire, and before we could displace our mortars, your counterfire would arrive. It was too quick. It was as if every American platoon now had its own artillery officer." This erosion of a key tactical advantage had a cascading effect. German infantry, deprived of the reliable, swift, protective fire of their mortars, were forced to rely more on fixed defenses and direct fire weapons, making them more susceptible to American flanking maneuvers and massed artillery barrages. The U.S. mortar had evolved from a reactive, supplemental tool into a proactive, battle-winning system. The tangible, physical aftermath was seen in the changing patterns on the ground. Earlier in the war, a captured American position would often include intact or destroyed mortars overrun because their crews could not displace fast enough under counter battery fire. By 1945, U.S. mortar sections had adopted the German emphasis on shoot and scoot. With their rapid-fire missions completed in 2 to 3 minutes, they would break down the M1 and move to a pre-planned alternate position before effective return fire could be targeted at them. They had internalized the tempo the Germans had once mastered, but now backed by a more efficient fire control system. The tool that had once symbolized American sluggishness was now an emblem of agile, lethal efficiency. This newfound parity, and then superiority, in the indirect fire duel at the battalion level, freed American commanders to use their heavier artillery in more decisive, operational ways. No longer did every skirmish require a desperate call for divisional artillery support. The 81 mortar could handle the immediate, close-in threat. This allowed the vast and logistically superior American artillery arm to concentrate on deeper targets, supply dumps, road junctions, reserve formations, and headquarters, systematically dismantling the German army's ability to function as a cohesive whole. The graphical firing table did not just win firefights, it helped unlock the full, crushing potential of American combined arms doctrine. The final ironic testament to the system's success was its quiet adoption and the fading of the myth that had once surrounded the enemy's weapon. By V-Day, the moaning Mini had lost its aura of invincible terror. The nickname persisted, but the dread had been methodically drained from it by a combination of overwhelming Allied air superiority, devastating counter-battery radar, and most intimately for the infantryman, by the newfound speed and accuracy of his own mortar. Support. The U.S. Army's investment in simplifying and decentralizing fire control had paid a disproportionate dividend. The graphical firing table was not a secret weapon, but it was a transformative one. Its legacy was cemented in the post-war analyses conducted by the U.S. Army's Historical Division and the insights of officers who had fought from Normandy to Czechoslovakia. General James M. Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, noted in his reflections that the increased responsiveness of organic mortar fire was a critical factor in the mobility and survivability of his paratroopers in the final campaigns. It gave the company commander a weapon of immediate decision, he wrote, echoing the very principle the Germans had once owned. The system validated a core truth of modern infantry combat: that initiative at the small unit level must be backed by immediate, lethal authority. The technological and doctrinal echoes of this wartime evolution resonated long after 1945. The GFT principle of precomputing complex ballistic solutions into a quickly readable format became standard for decades. It evolved into more sophisticated versions for recoilless rifles and later, direct-fire weapons like tanks. More profoundly, it entrenched the philosophy of pushing fire control forward. The modern U.S. Army's emphasis on the digital battlefield, where a forward observer with a laser rangefinder and a handheld computer can call in coordinates for a precision strike within seconds, is the direct philosophical descendant of the laminated card in a mortar sergeant's pocket. The goal remains unchanged: to collapse the timeline between seeing a target and destroying it. For the German Granatwerfer, the war's end was a final technical footnote. The 8cm GRW-34 was such a sound design that it was copied and used by numerous armies for decades after the war, including the French, as the Mortier de 81 MLE 2731, and even the early Israeli Defense Forces, but the system built around it, the speed-focused doctrine, the deeply trained crews, the tactical integration was shattered. Its defeat was not a result of inferior engineering, but of an adaptive enemy who identified and attacked the true center of gravity, the process behind the projectile. The Americans won the mortar duel not by building a better tube, but by inventing a faster brain. This silent contest of calculation, waged in the mud and snow of Europe, demonstrated that in the age of industrial warfare, the most decisive innovations could be intellectual rather than purely mechanical. It was a victory of procedure over tradition, of distributed intelligence over centralized control. The story of the mortar in the Second World War is more than a tale of competing steel tubes. It is a parable of adaptation, a quiet testament to the fact that in warfare the most profound revolutions are often those of process, not product. For years, the hollow thump of the German Granatwerfer represented a specific kind of dread, the fear of an unseen, mathematically precise enemy who owned the very seconds of your life. It was the sound of a doctrine perfected, of a weapon seamlessly woven into the fabric of infantry action. The American response was not to replicate that doctrine, but to dismantle its core principle, the monopoly on speed, and reconstruct it on a more democratic, scalable foundation. They did not create a superweapon. They created a super tool, a piece of paper that could turn a sergeant into a ballistician, that could distill the arcane science of indirect fire into a simple, graphic truth. In doing so, they shifted the psychological weight of the battlefield. The anxiety of waiting for the next incoming round began to transfer to the other side of the hill. This conflict within a conflict reminds us that technological advantage is fleeting. The German system was brilliant but static. The American system, born of necessity and forged in the fury of combat, was adaptive. It proved that the true measure of a military is not just the quality of its weapons, but the agility of its mind, its capacity to learn, to simplify, and to empower the individual soldier with the authority of science. In the end, the feared moan of the mortar's flight was answered not by a louder roar, but by quicker calculation, a silent click of a plotting scale on a laminated chart. It was a victory of cognition over concussion, a reminder that even in the storm of high explosives, the sharpest weapon is a thought, conceived and executed in time.